Our speaker tonight and I have something in common. We weren't our primary start in life is both in biology. So she's a microbiologist. I tended to the macro stuff and studied natural history. But we both share a love of history. And as a microbiologist who had ancestors who served in the Civil War, she got hooked because she learned how many men died of infection who had never been wounded. And the microbiologist in her was hooked. One thing led to another, and I'm going to let her tell her story, but she discovered the papers of our subject tonight, Helen Noy Hoyt. And the historian and the biologist got together, and they tonight will tell you the story. Would you please welcome from Madonna College, Dr. Ellen Smith.
Well, 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 it's a pleasure to be here. You know, I have a son that lives near Detroit on Lakeside Drive, something like that. He's some kind of real estate person. I'm portraying tonight Helen Noy Hoyt. And I was the youngest nurse at Annapolis Hospital, General Hospital number 1, from August of 1863 to July of 1864. I did not fill Dorothea Dix's ideal nurse instructions at all. Too young. She wanted him between 35 and 50. Too pretty. She wanted them plain to the point of repulsion. Unmarried. Not a widow, not someone who had a husband in the service. And I enjoyed wearing hoop skirts and ruffles and all the things she totally disapproved of. But like the other nurses, we all had one thing in common. We were inordinately committed to taking care of our boys and hopefully getting them well. Tonight I'm going to talk about some of the letters that I wrote home to my family. One of the things I did, I addressed every letter to a different family member, so each person would get a chance to have the pleasure of reading the letter first. And then they passed them around. I'm from Buffalo, New York. I'm about 60-something right now. And the man I ended up marrying was one of my patients. My father was a grist mill machinery manufacturing person. He had a company in Buffalo, and Buffalo was sort of a central place where grains from all across the Great Lakes area came, and much of it was milled there in Buffalo. So Daddy's shop did very well with their machinery. I had 3 brothers and sisters that survived to adulthood. Richard, who was the oldest, Elizabeth, also called Lizzie, and the youngest, Elisha, who was also called Hattie. 5 of my other brothers and sisters died in infancy, as many of the children did at that time. I worked at U.S. General Hospital number 1 in Annapolis, Maryland. I'll tell you how I got there in a moment. But this is how I describe the journey with my dad. You know, young ladies simply didn't travel alone then. And so Daddy took me to Annapolis so I'd be protected on the way and he could check out the facilities where I'd be working. But this is how I describe the journey. We had the same car, and a handsome one too, through from Williamsport. We were glad enough to get in the city, Baltimore, and I doubt if we would have left if we could last night, although Papa thought if we could go by water, we would, which would be much relief. However, we came here, and after converting myself from a contraband to Nellie Noy, we had a refreshing supper. In the last paragraph of one of my earliest letters, I say, "Will you save all my letters together for me, which I write while I am away? I think they will be interesting to look over at some future time." This particular illustration is taken from the hospital stationery. The hospital stationery had this engraved illustration at the very top, and it shows the Naval Academy where the hospital was based. The unit that I served in was Unit 5, and it was the tents that were on the parade ground facing the water. I have pictures. Okay. Now, these are a little hard to see, but these are some pictures of the letters I sent home to my family. People in the 20th century are having a great deal of difficulty reading them. The one on the the right, shows something that I tended to do a lot. I'd get to the end of the letter and have like 2 sentences left to go. And instead of starting a whole new piece of paper, I went back to the first page, turned it 90 degrees, and wrote crosswise. I hope the lady who wrote these down had no problems watching me or reading them. This dashing gentleman was Dr. Vanderkieft. He was the head surgeon at the hospital. I met him at Smoketown Hospital near Antietam about a year before I started working with the soldiers. And one of my great friends turned out to be one of the nurses that he brought with him to Annapolis. He was quite the dashing man. Unfortunately, he died a year after the war in the home of one of the other surgeons in the unit. Joshua Chamberlain was so impressed with the medical care he got under this man that he recommended him for a brevet promotion. This dear lady is Sister Adeline Tyler. At the time I got to the hospital, she was the superintendent of the nurses. This is how I described her. She belonged to an order of deaconesses called Sisters of Mercy of the Episcopalian denomination. A rigid disciplinarian and bigoted churchwoman, but a cordial, noble-hearted woman of at least 60 or 65 years. She was a large person of commanding appearance and presided at the nurses' table, requiring all to stand while saying grace. In 1864, in the spring, she had to retire because of health issues. But she was an amazing person. These are some of the other nurses that were with me in Annapolis. Many of them were from the state of Maine. And it turns out that there were a large number of nurses overall that came from Maine. You might be more familiar with the 20th Maine that fought with Joshua Chamberlain. But many of these women were also from Maine. Amelia Quimby was from Stroudwater. Emily Dana was from Portland, Maine. Mary Lizzie Dupree from Portland. And of course there was Ruth Ellis and Abby Howe. These were the youngest of the group. There were some older women who had been married and so forth. Many of these women got mentioned in the early part of the 21st century in a book called A Vast Army of Women by Linda Sudlow, which documents a number of women who fought or served and had Maine connections. These are scenes taken by the hospital photographer, and I had them with my letters. The top one is a picture of me in front of the supply tent with the supply sergeant and the chaplain. Note the detailed expression on my face. The second one shows a number of us nurses in front of Section 5. They're on the parade ground where the tents were pitched. The tents were actually pitched on wooden platforms that kept the patients and us out of the mud, basically. They were heated during the winter with a wood stove. And it was interesting. I noticed that the patients in the tents seemed to get better faster than the men who were quartered in the buildings around the parade ground. The gentleman that I ended up marrying was Bernie Hoyt. He was from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I live in Grand Rapids now. I've had 5 sons. They are all wonderful young men. Bernie passed away last April in February of 1900. That's why I'm in widow's weeds tonight. He was born in Chautauqua, New York. His family first moved to what is now Oakland County in Michigan, and then in the 1850s moved west to Kent County and Paris Township. He served in the 6th Michigan Cavalry as part of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade with Custer. They were in most of the major battles in the Eastern Theater. And he was finally wounded at Liberty Mills near Orange Courthouse in September of 1863. He was captured and held as a Confederate prisoner until September 29th, when he was shipped to Annapolis by steamer, and he arrived at the hospital on September 30th. You know, a lot of articles that we really needed to take care of our boys were not supplied by the Army. Instead, they had to come to us through private donations, through the Sanitary Commission, through the Christian Commission. And a number of things such as shirts, hospital gowns, slippers, toothbrushes, the Army was not supplying us. And periodically I wrote home to the church ladies. There was a dear sewing circle at the Presbyterian church at home. Daddy was one of the deacons, and the sewing circle spearheaded donations to my boys. This is what I wrote. Through the kindness and liberality of the agent of the Christian Commission, Reverend I.O. Sloan, much has been given. Without its contributions, we should have had but little. But nothing can take the place of those private boxes, placing in our hands means to work with, unmasked and without delay, and speaking emphatically, entirely minus of the red tape system. a very significant phrase in hospital life. They are to the several benevolent commissions what the commissions are to the government dispensations, coming like helping hands to assist immediately and scatter blessings impartially. And I was very faithful in sending a thank you note for every package that I received. Mama saved those for me too. This is the steamer New York. It was the ship, the hospital ship, that brought our patients to us. When I first went to Annapolis, most of the patients had been released from Confederate prisons. So they were in pretty bad shape. Some of them were at Libby Prison in Richmond, where they sent mostly officers. Some came from Belle Isle, also in Richmond, where the enlisted men went. Some were even from Andersonville. And while Andersonville gets a lot of the bad press of the day, I understand now that many of the Union prisoners were also treated pretty badly. We heard the stories of the poor living conditions. And hundreds of men would arrive on this boat. We would all go down to the wharf to greet them and answer the cheers of deliverance with ours of welcome. The boat from, and this is one of the descriptions of the men coming in. The boat from Richmond arrived this morning. We all went to the wharf at the foot of the yard to see them land. There were between 800 and 900, and oh, such looking men. Filthier than anything you can imagine. Ragged, begrimed, hideous. Between sympathy for their sufferings and joy at their return, we stood in saddest silence while they passed. Nearly 100 were sick or wounded, mostly sick. Poor, poor boys. Somebody's brother or husband would suggest itself, as one feeble fellow after another tottered along. Some were carried on stretchers. At dinner today, our ladies were repeating some of the remarks made. One poor boy said he felt as though he dropped from hell to heaven. They report many sick on Belle Isle, suffering terribly. Is it not too much for human endurance to think how they treat our men? Normally, nurses were paid about $12 a day, private's wages, or $12 a month, private's wages, plus room and board. I chose not to get paid, so I kept having to ask my family to send money, to send stamps, so I could purchase items in town for the boys, like toothbrushes and so forth. We also were entitled to private's wages, food rations. And I wrote home with this story. It is too funny to hear us talk about our rations. We are entitled to regular soldiers' rations amounting to 18 cents apiece every day. That multiplied 15 times makes us quite a little ration fee, which we take care in drawing what we wish, provided we do not go over the amount. Last month, Sister Tyler got us quite in a little fix by running us in debt, and we had to make it up ourselves. Sometimes we come quite short, and we have had many a breakfast of bread and butter and coffee alone, and not much of that. We miss meat very much. when we have it, I have a fastidious feeling about eating it. It don't taste like home meat. However, we fare first rate for soldiers and ought not to complain. I feast on fresh air and grow plump every day. It really seems as though I lived out of doors entirely and was never more free from rheumatic difficulties in my life. In October of 1863, President Lincoln issued his proclamation making Thanksgiving an annual federal holiday of prayer and thanksgiving. He issued quite a nice little proclamation and set the date for November. Well, I have a couple of stories to tell about that first Thanksgiving, since it's so close to that time of year now. One of my family friends from Buffalo was Colonel Adrian Root. He was in the 94th New York. He was the commander of that unit. He was captured at Gettysburg and was ultimately made in charge of Camp Parole near Annapolis. This was the station where men were sent after they were paroled, but before they were exchanged. We had a system of so many privates per general or per corporal, colonel or whatever. And the men were not supposed to return to their units till after they had been officially exchanged. Colonel Root didn't want to go back until he was exchanged, and so he was made commander of Camp Parole. All the men had to do was sit around and gamble and drink all day. So he kind of had a tough job there. Well, anyway, one of the New York papers ran a story about Camp Parole and their Thanksgiving celebration. And since it mentioned Colonel Root, I thought I'd share it with you. This was Thanksgiving in Camp Parole, how the soldiers dispose of turkeys. For the past few days, unusual activities seemed to prevail around the commissary department in this camp, and Captain Alley, our efficient commissary, might be observed dashing around in all directions, which of course led to the belief that something more than ordinary was afoot. Soon, however, all surmisings were put to an end by the arrival in camp of swarms of fine, fat turkeys. And the news soon spread around that our ever-thoughtful commander, Colonel A.R. Root, had issued orders for Thanksgiving dinner to be prepared on an extensive scale. Nothing was now talked of but roast turkeys. Squads of men were detailed, and the work of death commenced. And so deadly was the onslaught that by the evening of the 23rd, near 200 turkeys lay dead on the field. Not one escaped to tell the tale. Well, my family decided to send a package to me to be shared with my friends. And when I received the box from home, I hurriedly wrote back to them. Just arrived direct from Buffalo by express, a small exclamation point, grocery store. Hail, all ye that hunger. Well, 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 I heard of a Thanksgiving box to come, but what immense imagination could have comprehended such a monster? If you expect me to thank you, I'm afraid you will be disappointed. the English dictionary has not a word which expresses the more than thanks my heart feels for you. I think it was far easier for you to express yours than I am to return it. To him who knoweth the secrets of the heart, my gratitude rises. He and he alone can interpret the unspoken languages. His richest blessings be upon you, one and all, who have so often and well remembered your absent one. May your hearts feel the sweet blessedness of giving as fully as mine has in receiving. The next day, I finally caught a moment to complete my thoughts. And I said, I have been trying my hardest to write to you before, but it seems as though business increases every moment. Now I must do it. The box has arrived just in time, and I cannot tell you of the fun I had in unpacking it in my room. All the goodies scattered around over chairs, table, and bed, laughed over one thing and cried over another. Now you must hear more of the box. After arranging first one plan, then another, to enjoy its contents, Hallie and I, my friend Maria Hall, finally thought we would give a party. We invited all the ladies and several gentlemen from Dr. Vanderkeef's office with Dr. Ely to tea around 7 o'clock. I set the table in our large dining room. Hallie brought oysters, and one of the other ladies furnished a fruitcake from Portland, Maine, which cut up with my white cake was just it. Then we had the nuts and raisins and put on 2 plates mixed, 2 bowls of peaches and 1 of cranberries, 3 plates of crackers, smoked beef 2 plates, cheese 2 plates, and grapes 2 plates. We labeled some more apples and put them on the table, cannonball style, at intervals here and there. Mrs. Vanderkeef sent us a great big goose, which occupied one end of the table, and a hot chicken at the other. My cold one I put over at the side, but it was liked much better than all the rest. It was very nice. You see, I would take nothing but buffalo articles for my part. The bill of fare was first oyster stew, then goose or chicken, peaches and cranberries, cake, smoked beef, cheese, tea or coffee, nuts and raisins, grapes, apples. I had no idea it would make so much. But the table looked full and reminded everybody of home, so the extent of an inward tear on my part. The nice butter also took part. We had a joyous party, I assure you, and such sport over the apples. On the very smallest I could find, I put full diet, and on the largest, low diet. You made a pleasant time for us all. Nothing could have pleased me more than this making such a nice supper for all. I have still 3 cans of fruit left, 1 chicken, half the cheese and smoked beef, and the little papers of nuts and raisins I did not put on the table. I gave some away today to James, Dudley's nurse, and made him up a little package of goodies. All the ladies wished me to send you many thanks for your entertainment. How am I doing on time? Okay. In April, I got a package from the church ladies, and I sent them a thank you note. As a postscript to the letter, I wrote, I have requested one of my boys to write you a letter of thanks. You may expect to hear from him in behalf of his comrades soon. And so in a letter dated April 18th, The soldier wrote to the sewing circle at the church, and he says, "As I understand, sanitary supplies which are distributed in Section 5 of this hospital are furnished by your society. I thought that perhaps you would like to hear from a soldier who, while suffering from a severe wound, was the recipient of many delicacies sent by you, and who since, being better, has observed the great amount of good done through your agency to many another sick and wounded man. Ladies, pardon me for speaking of myself. I was severely wounded in the shoulder last September near Orange Courthouse, Virginia, and after being wounded was captured and carried a prisoner to Richmond and lodged in the Libby prison. I was soon after paroled and brought by steamer, New York, to this place. When I reached this hospital, my wound was in a very bad situation, and from the effects of exposure, a chill fever had set in. My appetite was gone, and of the rations furnished by the government, I could eat nothing. So you see, I was in a very uncomfortable situation. But thanks to your society, which furnished the supplies and delicacies so necessary to a person in such a condition, and to Miss Noy, who has executed so faithfully her mission of mercy, I am now quite well, and although I have lost to a great extent the use of my left arm, shall, as soon be exchanged, join my regiment in the field. Believe me, ladies, I shall ever be grateful to you, and if wishes on any part for your welfare here and hereafter would be of any avail, I have them. The men can never reward you unless it be by performing their whole duty to our common country. But I trust there is one who will reward you for the kindness and charity which you have shown toward our sick and wounded. Very respectfully, a soldier." In July of 1864, I was on my way home. I was needed at home to be with my mother, who was ill. And about that time, the Army decided to evacuate the hospital, send as many men home as possible or back to duty, get the nurses out of town, because the Confederates were threatening Washington, D.C., and raiding in the area around Baltimore. I was involved in a train raid, but I'll save that story for another night, if I get invited back. 2 years after the war, I married my sweetheart, Bernie Hoyt, who had that really awful shoulder wound. And I moved to Michigan. This is a picture of us in later life. Myself on the left, my husband on the right. And this is our home in Grand Rapids. We built it, and we lived there through most of our marriage. It's in beautiful condition. This is my husband's office building on Pearl Street in Grand Rapids, where he had his law office, and he also served as a judge in Kent County. After the war, he came back, finished his law studies, passed the bar, and a year later we were married. This is where we have found eternal rest. At least my husband has. My father's double plot in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Buffalo, New York, houses all of the Noy children, including my 5 siblings who died early. My husband's buried there. Hopefully I will be, and maybe some of my sons. So that's kind of the story, or at least part of it, of my service as a nurse. I visited a Russian warship and met a handsome young officer. I visited a contraband camp. And of course, then there was the train raid. In the spring of '64, I was nursing people who had been wounded at the Wilderness and other horrible battles of that spring offensive. And then instead of seeing starving men, I saw men very, very sick from their wounds. But I hope I've given you a little bit of insight into what it was like to be a nurse and the kinds of things I witnessed. Maybe my letters will be of interest someday for someone else to look at. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Because Nurse Nellie loves to talk. Yes?
Was most of the hospital that you were at, is that mostly for recuperation for soldiers? Were most of the surgeries done in the field hospitals immediately after the battles?
Very good question. The way the medical corps was organized, there was a triage station near the battle lines, and that basically was a place, they called it a dressing station, but that's kind of a misnomer because they saved the dressings. You know, if they were going to cut off the leg, they didn't put a bandage on it, okay? They just stopped the bleeding. And then the men were transferred to the field hospitals. Here they did the primary amputations. That is, if they were bleeding really badly, it got cut off. And that was because the soft lead bullets caused so much damage to the tissue and also took with it pieces of the uniform and the dust and the dirt and so forth into the wound, shattered the bones. Then, as soon as the men were able to travel, they were transported to a general hospital for recovery. It might be by wagon, it might be by steamer, as the New York was. It might be by train, and they stacked them in like cordwood in the trains. And then the general hospitals were generally in large cities. There were like 8 or 10 around Washington, D.C. We had 2 in Annapolis, plus Camp Parole had a hospital. So there were a lot of general hospitals around.
How many letters did you find?
About 50. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, guys. The letter to the church ladies at home where she says one of my men is going to write to you, the letters had been pasted into a book sort of thing, and I was in chronological order, and I was going through them day after day. He arrives at the hospital the end of September. She mentions him in a letter on the 30th of March. So every morning I'd go in, is today the day? Is today the day? Well, those 2 letters, the letter to the church ladies and his letter to the church ladies, were the last 2 letters in the collection. They were the last 2 I worked on. And I transcribed her letter and read the little postscript that said one of my men will write. And I sort of flipped over the last letter, and it was signed a soldier. And then I started working on it. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was wounded near Orange Courthouse, Virginia, and I almost went nuts. because I knew who it was. It was the man who became her husband. But that was one of the fun things that happened. Have I got time for a little story? What?
Sure. Okay, tell the story.
Okay. Some of you came in and I had that film loop running with all the soldiers' pictures and the music behind it. I used to announce for the Dodworth Saxhorn Band, and that was a number we played quite often because it was written by the director of the orchestra at Ford's Theater, and it was to be premiered on Good Friday in 1865, and it never got played. And the pictures that I had, many of the pictures, especially the nurses and those soldiers, I got from a collection from a man named Pete Petrovich. He contacted me on the internet because he had gotten my name from the Ann Arbor Civil War Roundtable website. And I said my research interests were Helen Noy and Bernie Hoyt. And he writes me and says, "It's my greatest desire in life to find out everything I can about Helen Noy and Bernie Hoyt." Okay. So I write him back and I said, well, I transcribed these 50 letters, yada, yada, yada. He writes me back and says, I have pictures. And I'm thinking, I will fly to Bora Bora to see these things if I have to. So I wrote him back and I said, I'm in suburban Detroit. We really need to get together. He writes me back and says, I'm in suburban Detroit. In Livonia. Well, Madonna University is in Livonia, in case you haven't checked the map lately. And then he promptly goes on vacation for 10 days. I eventually was able to scan all of them in. He's not a relative. His family acquired the photos at auction. Probably the same auction that the letters were bought by the Clements Library, where they now reside. And I think it was the April 30th or the March 30th letter that Nellie wrote home. She talks about how 2 of the kitchen boys bought her a photograph album for her hospital photos. And that's the album he had. In addition, he had her discharge certificate from the nursing corps. That's a copy of it. Her medal for her service, and actually he brought me that one as a gift for me, so I'd have one to wear. And the lieutenant's bars from Bernie's uniform, several other photos, including a picture of the office building in Grand Rapids. And a year ago, August, I spent a day with one of their great-great-grandsons in Grand Rapids. And we checked, and that office building was, in fact, his grandfather's office. We went by the house. We drove around on several other sites in town. We swapped documents, copies of documents, all of that sort of thing. So I have had an amazing journey working on all of this. The train raid thing, I have Nellie's description of it. Wasn't in one of her letters, it was in a narrative she wrote shortly before she died. The head of the raiders was Harry Gilmore, a Baltimore area partisan who was wreaking havoc with his not so nice raiders in the area. And he describes the whole setup in his autobiography. I went to the National Archives, and the reason Gilmore picked that train was because he knew there would be a Union general on it. He had been recuperating at the hospital. They put him on that so he could go home to finish his recuperation. He was traveling in civilian clothes. And he wrote up his story of the train raid. So I have all three of them. When I found that in the National Archives, I was practically doing handsprings. And you know what? At the National Archives, they let you reshelve your own microfilm. I almost died. I couldn't believe it. Because every other library you go to, put the microfilm here, we'll file it for you. Okay? This was just a heck of a lot of fun to work on.
Now, have you written a book?
I'm trying to work on it. I applied for a sabbatical leave for this coming winter semester, and they did not grant it. So I'm trying to put things together. Most of the people she mentions in her letters, we have the photographs of the soldiers. And my new best friend, Pete, has gotten pension and service files from the National Archives on all of the guys. So we have their background. I couldn't believe it when he said, I have pictures. And even the Russian lieutenant that she met on the Russian ship, he writes me and says, by the way, did she mention a Russian lieutenant? And I almost died because she describes the photograph in her letter. It was just amazing.
Any other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Probably, she probably didn't, because it wouldn't have been maybe the proper thing to do at the time of this, when women were first getting in. But I wondered if in any of her letters, she kind of actually breaks down and says how terrible it is to see and how hard it is. Does she ever show any emotion in any of her letters?
Well, I read you a little bit about her reaction to the soldiers coming off the ship.
Right, but I mean, that's a very general. She doesn't, I'm looking for, she picks out a soldier and says, he came in today and this has just been horrible for me to take.
She describes the soldiers. She describes sitting up at night with them, waiting for them to die.
Okay, she does get me.
She talks about snipping hair to send to their families.
Okay.
She talks about, and one of the soldiers had some of his hair made into hair ornaments for her and Maria Hall as gifts when he left.
So she does get a little more personal.
Right. She talks about how the nurses sang to them, things like Home Sweet Home and the Star Spangled Banner. She talks about being a substitute organist in church when Burnside was in town and how nervous she was and how fast the hymns went that morning. She was a very devout person. Daddy was a deacon in the Presbyterian church. She decried the hospital band playing waltz music for a concert on Sunday because it was dance.
That's what I was looking for, things that were a bit more, like I say, things that would get to you. I put myself in, if I put myself into that position, this is what I would have been writing, the things that hit me and stuck with me, and I really had dreams about it.
She, because of that little paragraph she had in one of those first letters where she said, these letters might be interesting to look at someday, she had a sense of history and so forth, and I think she wrote them with that in mind. There were no scratch outs. There were no lines drawn through words and that sort of thing. It was, you know, as if she had written them out longhand first. I don't know that she did. But especially in the spring, when that spring offensive was happening, the letters got rather sketchy. She talked about how if they waited to do the amputations till they got there to Annapolis, those guys usually didn't make it. One of the nurses died during that time, I think from typhoid fever. I'm not sure, I can't remember for sure.
That's another thing I didn't, but I guess they would have been subjected to the different things that the boys were coming back with. And even all the, say the dirt and that, lots of bacteria that could have been picked up by them.
Who knew that having the drinking water supply downstream from the latrines was bad? The surgical instruments got rinsed off if the handles got too slippery to hold because of the blood. I mean, seriously, water was usually in very short supply in the field hospitals. So they didn't wash them very much. It was by accident the Confederate surgeons found out that by boiling horsehair you cut down on the infection, because all they had was horsehair. They couldn't get the silk suture material, so they had to boil it to get it soft enough to use, and they had fewer infections. What a concept.
Well, I remember reading about the first surgeon that the same thing happened to him. The operation was so good that his patient died. And he said, there's something else. And then he told everybody they should wash their hands before anybody was going to operate. They laughed at it. They actually laughed at it. And then he stuck with that.
Joseph Lister used to spread carbolic acid in the operating theater and rinse his instruments and his bandage material. And that cut down on the infection. One doctor had a nurse whose hands were just terribly irritated by that stuff. So he invented rubber gloves, not to keep the disease organisms out, but to keep the phenol from her hands. She married him. That was after the Civil War. Louis Pasteur didn't publish his paper on the germ theory of disease until 1867. Even if it had come out during the war, these guys didn't have time to read. They sometimes operate 48 hours in a row. One amputation every 10 minutes.
Question after the Civil War, you showed the photograph of their family home. I would assume it's in the Heritage Hill District?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It's at the very top of the hill next to Cherry Street runs this way, and they're on Paris Street.
Okay.
And it's like the first house down from Cherry.
Some of you have been hanging with the museum for some time. If you remember when we went to Grand Rapids to one of the museum exhibits at the Van Ansel Museum, we also did a bus tour of the Heritage Hill area. So that would have taken us right by their family home.
Mm-hmm.
So that's...
And they show up in 1870 in the census there. So I can only assume that they built the house. Their great-great-grandson is going to try to get it designated as the Hoyt home because he was a judge and a prominent attorney. I went to the rededication of the Civil War monument in Grand Rapids. I heard about it through the round table. And I figured Nellie and Bernie were there the first time, I'd represent them the second time. And one of the things, Weldon Petz read the original speech that was read. He's the Lincoln expert in this area.
Many of you have met. He was the one who
Yeah.
did the Lincoln presentation.
And there were two true sons of Union veterans there. They were both 100 years old. Because the restoration of the monument was spearheaded by the Sons of Union Veterans in Grand Rapids. So it was really fun to see them. I have pictures somewhere.
I appreciate you coming this evening. It is,
I have thoroughly enjoyed, Nellie was such a remarkable woman.
well, and it's neat. We do a lot of presentations, and a lot of it is based on secondary research, books that we read, sources that we find. But when history really gets, when it's real, is when you get to open a packet and look at the handwritten documents of a person whose thoughts were captured over 100 years ago. Having worked in archives just a little bit, we were talking about how powerful it is when you open that folder and you have right before you the real thing, uninterpreted. No other person has put their slant on it. It's the closest we get to sitting down and talking with a person who lived many, many years ago. And so to hear the letters, thank you for bringing the transcriptions, to hear the story from that person's lips is truly an important thing to do. And so we appreciate you coming. We hope you come back. We look forward to your book coming out.
You will be among the first to know, because I want to sell them. And I would be delighted to come back and talk about the Russian warships, the train raid, and some of the other things that happened to her.
Great, thank you so much. I hope all of you have a very wonderful Thanksgiving holiday, that you spend it with family, and maybe perhaps after you feasted a bit and you're sitting over that piece of pie, that you share some of your stories that you've been holding, that you remember your auntie or your uncle or your grandparents or that special person in your life, because we're the keepers of stories too. We are our own family's historians, and it's our obligation to pass those stories down. Just the other night I was cleaning out things in my storage room, and I ran on a box of letters, and they were the letters that my husband and I exchanged when he was in the Air Force. And they will be very special to my daughters, I think, in the future, and perhaps children that they might have someday. So if you have those letters, keep them. If you don't know how to keep them well, give us a call. Bill Boardman at the museum will be happy to plug you into sources for archival boxes so that they don't deteriorate as quickly, and so that they will be there for your descendants to enjoy. Because I think, as Nellie said, someone will find them interesting in the future. So drive safely. Thanks so much for